I've been asked by Vanessa to present you the nature restoration law that is now a regulation. So the nature restoration regulation that has entered into force in August. Next slide, please. So I will start my presentation by just giving you a bit of background, both on the argument that we have used for defending this proposed regulation, and then we will go a bit more in depth to explain you a bit the various targets. So among the various arguments that have been used for defending the need for nature restoration regulation, there is of course a biodiversity argument, as currently in the EU only 14% of the habitat assessments are favorable, and it's also quite a gloom picture also on the birds and the species. There is also an argument in terms of climate action, as since 2010, we have lost one third of our natural carbon sinks. But there is also more and more argument coming also from the economic side, or the socio-economic dimension, I could say. The third argument could be related to food security and agriculture, as because of climate change, there is now a critical risk of crop failures or bad harvests, including in especially in southern part of Europe. There is also an issue of protection of populations, as there is more and more floods and rainfalls, also due to climate change in particular. But last year, for example, 1/3 of the EU rivers exceeded the high flood thresholds at least one day during the year. And last but not least, there is also an economic and financial argument. It's a recent figure coming from the European Central Bank, where around 72% of EU companies in the Eurozone are highly dependent on at least one ecosystem services. So behind these figures, that means that most of the EU economics depends on the good state of nature. And because of the states of degradation that is currently experiencing European ecosystems, that's starting to be also an economic issue. Next slide, please. So that's a bit more in-depth look at the status of the wetlands, so the good condition and the good environmental status of wetland in the EU. So that's only focusing on the habitats. So there is 128 habitat types of wetlands in the EU, which cover around 174 square kilometers. So that's more or less 5% of the EU terrestrial areas. The conservation status on these wetlands is particularly bad, as we have lost 80% of the wetlands in the last centuries, but we still have 90% of assessments which are unfavorable, and among which more than half are showing deteriorating trends. There is also an additional stress caused by climate change, obviously. So looking at these figures, and these figures are coming from the reporting made by member states under the Habitats Directive, there is at least the need to restore 16% of these wetlands. And it can be even more if you're considering that more than half, around half of these wetlands, the status is still unknown. And in terms of recreation, so establishment of habitats, the estimation coming from member states is around 3,000 square kilometers. To highlight a bit the climate arguments, so there have been also a calculation made on the stock and sequestration of carbon thanks to these wetlands, in particular the peatlands. So you have the figure on the slide. It's quite important, especially on the peatlands, where only on the 3% of agricultural area in the EU, there is around 20% of emissions from agricultural land use. So that's also a connection with the water dimension, as you know, and I guess Chris will go more in depth on these aspects, that there is some strong link between the water table and the emissions in peatlands. Next slide, please. So on this basis, just to summarize, there is a continuation of the ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss across the EU. That shows also that the protection is needed, but it's not enough. So there is also a need to restore ecosystems. And we're also learning from the past, as in 2011, for the 2020 EU biodiversity strategy, there was a proposal for member states to have only voluntary targets of restoration, but the targets were not met. So in this, based on this experience, it was clear that we need to change the way to act at the EU level. The proposal made by the Commission was to take the form of a regulation. Why? Because it applies directly, so there is no transposition. So that corresponds also to the urgency situation. The idea of this proposed regulation was also to build on all the existing policy framework, being the nature directives, but also the water framework directive and the marine strategy framework directive for the marine ecosystems. And of course, following the Green Deal, the idea was also to highlight the synergies between climate change and biodiversity. So that was a bit all the mandate that was agreed for the Commission to make its proposal. Next slide, please. So in terms of legislative process, the Commission made its proposal in June 2022. Then it took around 1 year for the Council and for the Parliament to make their own version. So the Council adopted the general approach last year, and Parliament also voted various amendments also last year. So at this moment, so we have 3 versions of the same proposed regulation, so the Commission proposal, the Council version, the Parliament versions. And in terms of EU decision-making, we start what we call a trilogue, meaning that the co-legislators will try to negotiate one with another in order to reach only one version and to converge progressively where what will become the final regulation. So it took a couple of months to do this work of trilogue. And by the end of year 2023, we managed to have such political agreement, and then there will still a need to have some formal approval of this political agreement. So that was done by member states at the level of COREPER, then by the Parliament beginning of this year. Then member states needed a couple of months, of additional months, to be sure that it was a good regulation. But just after the European elections, they managed to adopt this this final regulation, which when then published in the official journal, and 20 days after the first day following the publication, it entered into force. So since August, we have now a nature restoration regulation, and it is clearly enshrined in the EU environmental acquis. Next slide, please. One important element in this timeline was at the international level, as in end of 2022, December, the parties under the Convention of Biological Diversity managed to have an agreement on the global biodiversity framework. So there is a lot of links between the nature restoration regulation and this framework, as it's a key regulation for EU and member states to reach the goal for 2050. So the first goal, which is about the integrity, the connectivity, the resilience of all ecosystems that have to be maintained, enhanced, and restored. So we have the word restoration there. But it's also closely related to the target 2 for 2030. Target 2 being about the restoration, as the parties agreed that by 2030, at least 30% of degraded areas are under effective restoration. So I've underlined the wording degraded areas because you will see that there is a slight difference with the metric that has been proposed in the nature restoration regulation. Of course, there is other targets that are relevant for restoration. Here, a non-exhaustive list. We could also add some other targets. And last but not least, there is also some links to be established with the implementation phases of this global biodiversity framework, in particular in terms of monitoring, planning, and reporting. So there is really a good match between the high level of alignment between the nature restoration regulation and this framework. Next slide, please. So that's now the main element of the nature restoration regulation. So there is some overarching objectives that are breakdown in various restoration targets and obligations. There is also a set of provisions about implementation framework. And of course, one important aspect that we will discuss is about the financing of the nature restoration in Europe. To start also, there is a definition section in this regulation. And I just copy paste here a part of the definition for restoration, which is the process of actively or passively assisting the recovery of an ecosystems in order to improve its structure and functions with the aim of conserving or enhancing biodiversity, ecosystem, and resilience. And then the rest of the definition is establishing some, by just listing all the way to contribute to the restoration targets and obligations. One important thing in this definition is it's about the process. So we are perfectly aware that for some ecosystems, restoration will take several decades. So the idea is really to start now, and all the obligations contained in the nature restoration regulations are about implementing restoration measures. So at least to start the restoration, and then, well, it will take the time that it will take. The general objectives is also related to 2030 horizon and 2050 horizons. So for the 2030, the general objective is to implement restoration measures on at least 20% of EU land and 20% of EU sea by 2030. So the figures in the previous slide was 30%, but it was related to degraded areas, whereas here in the nature restoration regulations, it's 20% of all land in the EU and all sea in the EU. So not only the degraded areas. Now, this difference comes from the fact that there is no consensual definition of degraded areas. And that's why, in terms of urgency, we prefer to have more basic metric, which is just considering all land and all sea, and then take a percentage on this one. For 2050, the objective is the same. It ensures that all ecosystems in need of restorations are covered by effective restoration measures. Then also, as part of these overarching objectives, you can find a bit the four arguments that were highlighted in the beginning of my presentation. So there is a biodiversity general objective, so the recovery of ecosystems. There is also some links with the climate action and land degradation neutrality, as all the restoration regulation will contribute to these general objectives. There is also an objective of food security. So restoration measures should be designed in a way to enhance food security. And then there is also the link with the Global Biodiversity Framework in particular, but not only, the Paris Agreement, also under the UNFCCC. So a contribution to the EU international commitments. Next slide, please. So the general objectives are declined in various specific restoration targets and obligations. The first three one on this slide, so the protected habitat types, the habitat of species, and the marine habitats, are building on the existing framework. So the four directives I've mentioned, so the nature directives, the marine strategy framework directive, and the water framework directive. Then we have six even, a new set of 6 restoration targets and obligations, which are quite innovative. And that's the first time in the EU that member states have such objectives in terms of restoration of urban ecosystems, of river connectivity, of pollinators population, in terms of restoration of agro-ecosystems, of forest ecosystems, as well as a reference to the pledge made in the biodiversity strategy, so for 2030, to plant 3 billion additional trees in the EU. Next slide, please. So I will go now a bit more in depth on all these various targets. So the first one, and this one will be particularly interesting for you because that's already a first set of obligations that will target the wetlands and the peatlands. So there is obligations and restoration targets and obligations now on all the habitats covered by the Habitats Directive. So there is around 230 habitats which are grouped into 7 groups. One of these groups is the wetlands, and that includes both coastal and inland wetlands. So you have a bit all the various types that are also considered. So the other groups are grasslands, river, lake, alluvial, and open habitats, and so on. But all the wetlands habitats have been gathered into one group. By 2030, member states have to restore at least 30% of the total area of all the groups. So there is a kind of flexibility, meaning that they can act on all 230 habitat types. And that's an obligation of improvement of the condition of these areas that are not that are currently not in good condition. By 2040, 2050, it is 60% and 90% of each group, meaning that in this case, there will be no possibility for member states, for example, to focus on the grasslands and do less efforts on the wetlands, but whether at 2040, 2050, for all these groups, so all the wetlands taken together, 60% of the area are not in good conditions will have to be covered by restoration measures, aiming to improve the good condition. There is also some obligation of re-establishment, meaning that in some areas that where currently there is no wetlands, there is now some objectives to restore these areas in a way to re-establish habitat types, including wetlands. So the objective is framed in terms of favorable reference areas, and these favorable reference areas to be determined by member states. But then by 2030, 40, 50, 30%, 60%, and 100% of the additional areas needed for each groups to reach this favorable reference area will have to be, again, covered by restoration measures, aiming to establish these habitats. There is also some obligations of restoration of habitat of species. It is not formulated as quantitative targets, but rather as an obligation of improvement of quality, quantity, and connectivity. Then another obligation is to fill knowledge gap. So by 2030, 90% of the total areas of all groups taken together have the condition has to be known. And by 2040, all areas, the environmental condition of all areas have to be known. Of course, all the regulation is based on the principle of using the best available knowledge and the latest scientific evidence. So each time that there is some new input coming from the research community, this has to be reflected in the restoration measures, in the planning, and so on. Last but not least, there is also an obligation of non-significant deterioration requirement, meaning that for all areas where good condition has been reached, or all areas that are already in good conditions or that are necessary to reach restoration targets, member states have to be sure that have to make efforts to be sure that there is no significant deterioration in order to stabilize the baseline of restoration. Of course, there is some derogation and flexibilities, especially for the very common and widespread habitats, but I won't go into such details except if there is questioned later. Next slide, please. I will go quickly on this one. It's just on the marine ecosystems. It's a bit the same structure than for the terrestrial, coastal, and freshwater ecosystem. So there is a kind of grouping of the various habitats. So group 1 to 6, it's more, it's mainly overlapping with habitat directives, but it's this kind of elements of biodiversity such as seagrass, macroalgal forests, and shellfish beds, and so on. Then there is also group 7, and this one is quite also a big innovation for the EU decision making, which is covering all soft sediments. So it's overlapping with the benthic habitats from the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, but it's covering large areas of marine habitats. Then you can see that, again, there is some objectives of improvement to good condition, some objective of reestablishment for reaching favorable reference areas, some objective of restoration of habitat of species, knowledge gap filling, non-significant deterioration requirement. So the structures is a bit the same, with a difference between group 1 to 6, which are a bit more these elements of particular interest for biodiversity, so very localized elements such as the coralligenous beds, the coral, the sponge, or the seagrass, and the group 7, which is about all the soft sediments, which are, I would say, perhaps less important for biodiversity, but there are also big importance for climate, as such group is also stocking a large quantity of carbon. Last but not least, there is also some provisions about how to ensure good use of the tools coming from the common fisheries policies, in particular the joint recommendations. Also some derogation and flexibilities when reestablishment, when 100% of reestablishment is not possible, some flexibilities on the non-deterioration, non-significant deterioration requirement, and further derogation for renewable energy and defense activities. But I won't go into detail on this one. Next slide, please. So now we're starting to enter a bit in this innovative...
Recording stopped.
We are now entering in the innovative targets. So in terms of urban ecosystems objectives, it is mainly based on two indicators, which are the urban green space at national level and the urban tree canopy cover in urban ecosystem areas. just meaning that by green space, it is a large scope. It can include, for example, the urban wetlands. So this is completely covered also by these urban ecosystem targets. Here, the objectives are to ensure non-net loss by 2030, either at national level or at the level of the urban ecosystem areas, and then to ensure increasing trends towards satisfactory levels. And you will see that this notion of satisfactory levels will come in a lot of targets. The guidance by the Commission will be prepared by 2028, and then member states will have to use this guidance to determine the satisfactory levels. So that's a bit postponing the concrete figures that we can put behind this satisfactory level. But the idea is indeed to at least stop the degradation now and then improve with time up to a certain level. Next slide, please. Another aspect that may be of particular interest for you is the Article 9 on the river connectivity. So here the focus is on all the artificial barriers to the natural connectivity of surface waters. And by connectivity, it's all the different connectivities, by the definition of barriers, it's all the barriers in terms of latitudinal, longitudinal, or vertical barriers. The idea here is there is two obligations. The first one is an inventory of all barriers, and it's really exhaustive, meaning that member states have to put efforts to inventory all the barriers that are preventing the natural connectivity of rivers and other surface waters. And then a subset of these barriers has to be identified. These subsets are the ones that are needed to contribute to various objectives. First, the targets for riverine habitats, so the link with Article 4. Then the objective of restoring at least 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers in the EU by 2030, and the baseline here is 2020. And then the functionality of floodplains. Next slide, please. Pollinators population targets. Again, the idea is to improve the pollinators diversity and to reverse the decline by 2030, and then thereafter to ensure an increase in trends until satisfactory level are reached. Under this article, there is also an additional provisions about a methodology for annual monitoring that will have to be prepared within 1 year. Next slide, please. Agricultural ecosystems. So that's another article which will be of key interest for you. So there is also various obligations. The first one is to enhance biodiversity of all agricultural ecosystems. So this time is not only limited to the habitats of union interest, but covering the whole range of agroecosystems. To be sure that the restoration measures implemented by member states are somehow effective, so of sufficient quality, we could say, there is an obligation to ensure some results in terms of indicators. So various indicators are listed at national level. The first one is the grassland butterfly index. Then you have also a relation with the carbon, with the stock of organic carbon, and the share with high diversity landscape features. On these three indicators, member states have to choose at least two of the three. So there is kind of flexibility. Again, same system than for the urban and the pollinators. There is a need to ensure an increasing trend until satisfactory levels are reached, and these satisfactory levels will be calculated by member states based on the guidance provided by the Commission. There is also an mandatory indicators that member states, all of them, have to report and to ensure an improvement. And this one, as we have some more robust data, we have also been able to formulate it in a way that contains some quantified dimensions. So on all the comland, farmland bird index, there is some specific targets to enhance by 2030, 40, 50, and the metric depends of the status of depletion of the bird species. Then, last but not least, there is also some quantitative targets on the peatlands, and that's also something which is quite innovative in terms of EU decision making. Though by 2030, 40, 50, member states have to restore at least 30%, 40%, 50% of all drained peatlands under agricultural use. A part of these restorations have to be under the form of rewetting, meaning that 1/4 of the restored dwelling peatlands. So 1/4 of the 30% by 2030 has to be reweighted. And then it's 1/3 of the 40% and 1/3 of the 50% that have to be reweighted. Of course, for such targets to be reached, there were a need to include some flexibilities and to precise some modalities. So there is some flexibility to count peat extraction sites and other types of dwelling peatlands that are under uses other than agriculture that can be accounted in reaching these targets. Some exceptions are also possible in terms of reweighting. So this 1/4, 1/3 can be reduced if duly justified. And then one key aspect is that this reweighting has to be incentivized. So it should not be under the form of obligations on farmers and landowners. Next slide, please. So that's the forest ecosystems. The same structure, same rationale than for the agricultural ecosystems is covering all kinds of forest ecosystems, not only those that are of union interest. So it's much bigger scope than the habitats. The obligation is also formulated in a way of reaching satisfactory level, increasing trends until satisfactory level are achieved based on various national indicators. There is one mandatory one, the forest bird index, like the forest, like the common farmland bird index in the previous slide, and then 6 out of 7 indicators. Some of them are about carbon and other about biodiversity. Next slide, please. So that's the reference to the 3 billion additional trees coming from the biodiversity strategy. One important thing on that is the quality of the trees to be planted. The idea is, of course, not to allow accounting of monoculture, for example, but rather to ensure that the trees that are planted are made in full respect of ecological principles, meaning in terms of ensuring species and age diversity, prioritizing native species, increasing ecological connectivity, and be based on sustainable forest management practices or greening of urban areas. So there is really a quality dimension which is strongly highlighted by the regulation. Next slide, please. Now we are finished with the targets, and I will present a bit more the implementation framework. One key aspect of that is the planning, and the various provisions about planning contained in the regulations have to be interpreted as a strong encouragement for member states to have strategic visions of restorations. A lot of flexibilities or responsibilities are with member states, meaning that it's up to them to decide which measures and where to achieve targets. It's also up to them to identify the areas that need restoration targets and to determine the satisfactory levels based on the Commission guidance. And it's also up to member states to decide the timing for putting in place measures, well, in a way that the various targets can be reached, of course. So restoration in this case has to be considered as very inclusive solutions. There is various provisions, meaning that it has to be designed in a way to contribute to the sustainable development of relevant regions and communities, to take into account the diversity of situation of various regions, including the social, economic, cultural requirements, and in particular the specific situation of outermost regions, even if they are not in the geographic scope of the regulations. Member states concerned on a voluntary basis can include these outermost regions. And then all the plans will have to follow a very open, transparent, inclusive, and effective process. Member states have to offer some early and effective opportunities for the public to participate in its preparation of all the national restoration plans. Last but not least, there is also some shall provisions about ensuring synergies with various aspects: climate action, land degradation neutrality, disaster prevention, but also agriculture and forestry, and of course, synergies between member states. Next slide, please. In terms of timeline for the national restoration plans, so we're under quite a tight schedule currently at the Commission, because by the 1st of December, we have to put at the table of the committee, of the Nature Restoration Regulation Committee, a draft implementing act to establish the uniform format for national restoration plans. Then member states will have 2 years to prepare the draft versions of the plans. Then 6 months for the Commission to do the assessment, 6 months back to the member states for the final plan. So we are now in August 2027, which means that, of course, the implementation of waste action measures has to start now and not wait until the national waste action plans are finalized, because the first targets being 2030. It's quite obvious that if member states are waiting for August 2027 to start implementing the work, by no means they will be able to reach the 2030 targets. The first revisions of the plans will occur at least in 2032. Next slide, please. So that's an example of synergies with climate policies. So it's what we call sponge landscapes. So that also includes actions on wetlands. So that may also be of key interest for you. So this kind of landscapes involves various restoration measures, upstream and downstreams, at the forest level, meaning that you can convert coniferous to deciduous forests, but also at the level of the rivers to ensure their connectivity. Also at the level of the wetlands, boarding the rivers, so in order to restore these wetlands, that the sponge activity can be reactivated. But that also includes restoration measures in the cities, so how to green the cities and ensure that they are well adapted to such landscape. This kind of landscapes show a lot of co-benefits in terms of climate actions, both in terms of mitigation, because such sponge landscapes can reduce a lot net GHG emissions. They can even stock a lot of net carbon removals. So that makes a lot of links with the climate law, the land use change and forest regulation, but also the carbon removal and carbon farming certificate framework. But it's also a lot of co-benefits in terms of adaptation, as such sponge landscapes have better resilience to drought and floods. So that makes also some strong links with the Article 4.5 of the climate law and the EU adaptation strategy. So that's really a strong focus on nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So here a bit all the integrated implementation framework, so meaning that the plans will not act alone. So these plans, as said, have to be established in close connections with a lot of other dimensions, be it climate, air quality, the other tools that member states can have on biodiversity, but also the river basin management plans, the marine strategies, also the CAP strategic plans. And this kind of holistic approach for the national restorations is also being complemented currently by some incoming regulations or legislations. So the soil monitoring law, the forest monitoring law. The plans will have also to be articulated closely with the monitoring and the reporting, meaning that the monitoring will ensure that all the indicators and all the areas covered by restoration measures that are planned in the national restoration plans will have to be carefully monitored. And if the monitoring shows that there is an inadequacy of the measures to reach the targets, in this case that triggers an automatic revisions of the plans, at least that triggers an obligation to revise the plans to be more precise. The monitoring is also closely related to the reporting, and there will be two kinds of reporting. So a 3 years based reporting on areas and barriers, and then a 6 years 6-year based report, which is more comprehensive, and that is about all the progress contained in the various obligations and targets documented in the plan. Next slide, please. So that's a bit the long-term perspective. So you can see that with this planning, monitoring, and reporting, a kind of cycle will be established. And you have here the timeline up to 2050 with various obligations of reporting, of planning, be it on the Commission side, on member state sides, or on the European Environmental Agency. One important thing also for you as in terms of research communities, I could say, is that the next review of the regulations will occur in 2033. So there will be an evaluation of all the impacts of restorations in terms of impacts on agriculture, forestry, fisheries, but more generally the wider socioeconomic effects. And then it will be also in 2033 that the Commission can propose, where appropriate, some proposal of amendments on the regulations, which can bring some additional restoration targets or to update targets for 2040, 2050. That's really an important horizon for all the research outputs, because at that time we will need, we will have to do all the collections of data knowledge in order to be able to update, if needed, all the targets currently contained in the regulation. Next slide, please. Last but not least, so how to finance all this work? First, we have to consider waste erosion not as a cost, but rather as an investment. And on our impact assessment, we have shown that the benefits by far outweigh the cost, meaning that for each euro spent on waste erosion, at least 8 can be expected in terms of return, especially in terms of ecosystem services. The investment needs have been estimated around 6 to 8 billion of euros per year, which can be covered by the pledge made by member states under the UN current EU budget, meaning that there have been some earmarking that have been accepted by member states in terms of dedicating some part of the EU budget to biodiversity. And there is currently more than 20 billion of euros per year unlocked for biodiversity. Not only for restoration, also for protection, but at least all the restoration needs could be covered by this envelope. Then there is also some opening in the restoration regulation to other kind of tool, being some private or public support schemes. And next year, the Commission will also prepare financial reports, quite comprehensive, looking at the resources, the needs, the gaps, and so on. On the right side, it's a bit an exhaustive list of all the EU funds available to fund restoration, but also national funds and public-private investment mechanisms. Next slides, and I will finish on these ones. An example of such tool of public-private mechanisms or how to channel private funding in restorations is all the work that we are preparing and sorry, and we will prepare on the nature credits. So you may have seen various pieces of communication made by the Commission since end of 2023 and more recently with this nature conference in Munich. It's also mentioned in the mission letter for the Commissioner designate Roswell. So under this mandate, we will work with member states, international partners, organizations to see the potential on nature credits as a tool to trigger private investments in nature restoration. Again, the purpose is not for compensations, but whether in terms of contributions. So how to trigger private investments in additional restoration and so on. I will stop here, and next slide is just to thank you for your attentions. And if there is some questions, I will try to answer to them. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Florian, for such a nice overview of the nature restoration law, which is our main topic in the discussions that we are hosting today. Thank you very much for your really nice overview. I'm going to pass the microphones to the people that are present here in the room, but also we checked the Zoom meeting because we have a question from Mathieu Gasolski. That he's asking what is considered restoration for peatlands in these cases. As far as I'm aware, peatland restoration doesn't make sense without rewetting. And from my perspective, if I can add something, and also correct me if I'm wrong, but there are clear metrics and specifics and requirements that the nature restoration law are mentioning in the manuscript, which is not only recovering and restoring certain percentages of the land in the member states, but also they mentioning some fractions and some parts of this land to be rewetted, right? So I think it's quite clear in the nature restoration law about the rewetting and the necessity of rewetting. But I don't know if you agree with me or you have any opinion or any other different answer to this question. Thank you.
Yeah, on the peatlands, including the forest peatlands, they are indeed covered both by the Article 4 on habitats, but also a bit by the Article 11, as there is a possibility for member states to consider dwelling peatlands and the other uses and agriculture up to 40%, also in the reaching of the quantitative targets for peatland restoration, including the sub-targets for peatland rewetting. Then Article 12 on forest is also quite relevant because there is some indicators in terms of soil organic carbon, dead wood also, tree to species diversity. So some of these indicators can be quite relevant also for forest peatlands. And last but not least, we can also consider the Article 8, which is about this restoration of not only the natural connectivity of rivers, but also the functionalities of the related floodplains, which means that in some cases it can also concern forest peatlands. But thanks for the question.
Perfect. Thank you, Florian, for the clarification. Also from Tula, from a sister project of REWET in Alpha Wetlands, ask in the chat, which article and targets concern forest peatlands? Article 4, habitat, or Article 12, forest, or both? Are both articles referring to targets in forest peatlands, or it's just themselves by, a single?
Okay.
I think he just answered.
I replied. Yeah, I just replied to this this question.
Oh, here you go, Tula. Do you want to add anything to your question?
I was just happy that I already got the answer, because I was thinking that it falls into several of the articles.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. So no need to question. Thank you. Any question from? Okay, so Marco. Florian, I'm going to present to you to Marco Bartoli, a professor of the University of Parma, that has a question for you.
Okay.
It's a kind of in-between question and comments. Thank you very much, first of all, for the presentation. It was super clear. I'm an ecologist, and I'm super happy to listen to these things, because they describe a perspective for us which is unbelievable. And we really hope, as Italians, that this will be pursued in all the countries. The first comment is about the contrast between the urgency of the actions and the flexibility that all the regulation. I guess it's democracy, not to be flexible, but isn't it time to change a little bit the flexibility into something which is strictly operational, with clear deadlines, with clear check of the advancement status of the application of the directive? This is the first. And the second is about the metrics. We rely a lot on diversity. We rely on the description of species, inventory of species, but we seldom go to the functioning of ecosystem as an important metric. So this is a new frontier for ecologists to use biodiversity to interpret the function. But in your opinion, is this included or will be included in the future in the evaluation on how restoration is effective? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. On the first point, I have to say that the nature restoration regulations brings still a lot of clarity here, and is setting some quantitative time-bound targets. So there is already a strong improvement, a strong added value based on the current framework. So the Habitats Directive, for example, the Bus Directive, where member states had already the obligation of restoring some habitats, but this obligation was not time-bound. Now there is some quantitative figures, meaning that in terms of improvement of conditions, it is 30% by 2030, 60 by 2040, 90s by 2050. In terms of reestablishment, it's also quite clear. So 60, 100% by 2030, 40, 50. So that's providing already a good, well, we are dissipating a bit the fuzzy obligations that were around the current directives by doing something very clear and straightforward. Also, in terms of monitoring, reporting, planning, there is also some clear obligations with clear time steps and close link between all of them, so that if at a moment there is a clear evidence that member states, the restoration measures are not suitable for reaching the targets, it will be seen through the monitoring, and then that will trigger an obligation to revise national restoration plans accordingly. So there is some mechanisms for strong ambitions contained in the regulation. Then in terms of metric, when you're looking at the indicators of agricultural ecosystem, for example, or forest ecosystems, you can see that some of these indicators, for example, are related to climate concern, like the stock of organic carbon, or being in cropland mineral salts, or in all forests. You have also all these elements about deadwood and so on. So that's kind of proxy where we are a bit touching these dimensions of functionality. Of course, that's an area where we expect a lot from the research community. So if by 2033, we can have some robust data sets at the EU-wide level, meaning that we are able to monitor the restorations using some indicators related to the functionality of the ecosystems, then we would say that yes, that's quite a good basis for being able to consider the introductions as an update of the regulation in 2033.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Florian, for answering Professor Marco's question. Also, we have a question in the chat from Astrid Severin, mentioning how can regions access the financing of the 20 billion per year that you have mentioned?
There is various funds that can be listed on this one. So various of them are accessible at the level of the regions. So that include the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, but also European Regional Development Fund. There is also the cohesion funds that have to be mentioned. Then there is also some other tools like the Invest EU or the Recovery and Resilience Facility, where there is still some money left on that. But yeah, most of the tool, I think, for the regions will be the European Regional Development Fund and the cohesion funds.
Okay, thank you very much, Florian. Because of lack of time and just to give it some stage to the next presenter, we need to keep going. But thank you very much for the presentation and for such a nice overview. So please, you can
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation and have a good continuation of the conference.
Thank you.
Should you have any questions, feel free to write to me. My email address is in the first slide. And
perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you, Florian.